Mike Clare. I'm the Associate Director for Public Policy at Memorial University's Leslie Harris Center of Regional Policy Development. I'm delighted to have you all here this evening, both those of you who are here with me at the St. Christopher's Hotel, as well as those who are watching on the internet. So thank you everybody for taking part in this. The existing fleet separation policy is a policy of the federal government, and it applies only to Atlantic Canada, as opposed to the vast majority of federal policies in the fishery or elsewhere, which are normally enforced across the country. This particular policy does not apply to the Pacific coast of Canada, home to many other fishing communities. The policy dates back about 30 years, and its original intent was to help sustain fishing communities. The idea behind the policy is that the only people who are allowed to fish, to harvest fish, are the owners and operators of fishing vessels. This policy therefore directly links the resource to those who actually harvest it and who, in theory, live in fishing communities. Now, a lot has changed in 30 years. Fish stocks have declined dramatically. Rural areas have seen their populations plummet. Those that remain in these rural communities are getting close to retirement, if they haven't reached retirement. Fishing technology has been revolutionized, and the fishery has been globalized. In light of all these changes, does the fleet separation policy still make sense? So this is the issue that we're going to look here tonight. Excuse me. So before I introduce our two speakers, a couple of rules of the game, if you wish. I'll outline the program for this evening. We have two presenters. They'll each present for about 20 minutes. And then we're going to have a Q&A with you, the audience. I'll ask our presenters to come and sit in the front, and then you can pepper them with questions or with comments. Those of you who are here with me, we have a wireless microphone. If you want to ask a question or a comment, just raise your hand. We'll get the microphone over to you. This is important because if you're for the people watching on the internet, we want to make sure that they hear your question as well as the response from our speakers. For those who are watching, thank you. For those who are watching on the internet, you can send us an email. Our technical assistant, John Duff, is going to put an email address that you can send a question or a comment, and we'll be happy. We'll read your comment or your question over the air. We're going to record this session for posterity because I think that the issue that we're dealing with tonight is important not just for the Port of Basque area, but for the province as a whole. So those who missed the event tonight, or those of you who are here and watch it, who want to review it later on, you can go to the Harris Center's website and catch the event there. We may not have time for every question or comment that you may have, but for those of you who are here with me at the hotel, we're going to have a reception afterwards. So we're going to finish at around 9 o'clock. We're starting a couple of minutes late. We may go a few minutes beyond 9 o'clock, but not very long. And for those of you who want to continue the discussion, we have a reception outside, and you're welcome to continue the discussion there.
Thank our partners for tonight's session, which are the Long Range Economic Development Board and the Marine and Mountain Zone Corporation, for their help and moral support in making this event happen tonight. So thanks to Johnny McPherson and to Lynn MacArthur and their respective teams for all their help. So it's now my pleasure to introduce our two speakers for tonight. And to save time, I'll introduce them both at the same time in the order in which they'll be speaking. Dr. Tom Cooper is Assistant Professor in the Faculty of Business Administration at Memorial University of Newfoundland, where he lectures in the area of strategy, risk management, and ethics values at both the undergraduate and graduate levels. His research is primarily focused on the interplay between strategy and risk management. He has researched and published on the fishery in Newfoundland, Labrador, and in Atlantic Canada. Specifically, he's published on Aboriginal fishery issues in Atlantic Canada, as well as the use of sustainability brands in the marketing of seafood. Tom holds a doctorate from the University of Warwick in England and a Bachelor of Commerce from Memorial University. Earle McCurdy probably needs no introduction, but since we've given one for Tom, we'll give one for Earle as well. Earle has been president of the Fish, Food, and Allied Workers Union, the FFAW, since June 1993. He's been working for the union since 1977. Prior to becoming president, Earle served as secretary-treasurer of the union for 13 years. Born in 1950, Earle grew up in St. John's and attended school at Prince of Wales Collegiate. He obtained his post-secondary education at Memorial University, where he received a Bachelor of Arts honors in 1972. He's a member of the National Executive of the Canadian Auto Workers, president of the Canadian Council of Professional Fish Harvesters, and a Canadian Commissioner of the Northwest Atlantic Fisheries Organization, or NAFO as we know it. We're delighted that these two very busy people have found the time to come to Port aux Basques to talk about this important issue. So I ask you all to welcome our two speakers and to welcome Tom Cooper to the podium.
Thank you very much, Mike. Thank you, everyone, for coming out on a windy day here in Port aux Basques, but I'm told this is the norm, so I feel at home being from St. John's. The presentation I'm going to give today, the Harris Center asked me to talk a little bit in terms of the fleet separation policy, outline it so that we have a common area in terms of what we're going to discuss, what's the rationale. Then we're going to get a little bit into some of the, in terms of the strategy, in terms of vertical integration, what are the advantages, what are the disadvantages, what are the options. And then finally, I'm going to try and end on, is there a way to achieve the advantages of vertical integration while maintaining the fleet separation policy at the same time? So what is the fleet separation policy? Mike gave a really good introduction to it, but just to reiterate, it's to separate harvesting from processing and disallow the issuance of new fishing licenses to corporations and processing companies. Although the corporations now, when we were speaking to Earle and preparing for this, the corporations can exist, but once again, it's the difference. Processing companies cannot own these licenses. It was initially adopted in 1979 and covers fisheries where license holders are restricted to using vessels less than 65 feet in length. Okay. So once again, this allows the issuance of new licenses to corporations, allows for the retention of licenses already held by corporations, including those involved in the processing sector. So if there was a company, once again, before 1979 that held these licenses, they were still allowed to keep them under the policy. And once again, it's less than 65 feet in length. So we're not talking about the offshore, we're talking about the near shore or the inshore as well. So let's take this up. I always like to go back to what I call first principles. So what is a policy? A policy is what the management textbooks tell us is a set of decisions which are orientated towards a long-term purpose or to a particular problem. And it's essentially a form of control. So if you have a problem, whether, for example, if you have a problem with privacy in your organization, then you have a privacy policy. If you have a problem with expenses, then you have expenses policy. It's, once again, it's just one of those ways to control an element or an issue or give direction for people within the organization or within an industry or in Canada or at a governmental level in terms of a country. So why the fleet separation policy? If we look, when I was researching for this, and you go back and talk to people when they were constructing the policy, there was basically three reasons in terms of why the policy was created. The first one was to reduce or eliminate corporate concentration of fishing licenses. If we go back to the 1970s, there were some really big companies that, once again, looked like they were going to have almost total control of the fisheries. Nickerson's, National Sea, Lake Group, etc. So there's a whole bunch of big companies, most of which don't exist anymore. Ensure that licenses and incomes were widely distributed. And thirdly, ensure the long-term viability of rural communities as well. So those were kind of, in terms of objectives, what they were trying to control in terms of policy, those are the three things. So what this basically disallows is what we would call management in business school about vertical integration versus horizontal integration. No, I'm great, Joanne. So what do we mean by that? So when we talk about vertical integration is basically just a process with several steps in the production and or distribution of a product which are controlled by a single company or entity. On the other hand, you can have horizontal integration. So it's not all companies are vertically integrated, not all companies are horizontally integrated. That means basically you have, you increase your market share or you increase your production by owning a similar company. So let's give some examples. Vertical integration example of an industry would be the oil and gas industry. Exxon, for example, they own production, they own gas stations, they're right across the way. On the other hand, you see the tech industry like Google, they own shares of companies, they have people doing research for them, but it's basically, once again, the tech industry for the most part is horizontally coordinated. So why if you did have vertical integration, what would be some of the positive things? Because right now, in the inshore and the nearshore fishery, we don't have, for the most part, we don't have vertical integration. It avoids the risk of uncertainty supply. So if you are a processor, so what you want to do is make sure that you have a certain amount of product so that you can process it when it comes in at a certain time, and once again, you can keep your plant operating. Enables better control of the flow of products into the market, take advantage of opportunities not now available. One of the things that, and some of this comes out from my colleague, Tom Clift, who's the author of the MOU document that was released by the Department of Fisheries and Aquaculture last year. One of the things you see is that there's a huge burden on the harvesting and on the processing sector because of the length of the season is so short. And ultimately, because people need to pay bills, they need to make sure that they get their product out, and this control of the flow is, in a number of ways, is dictated by the nature and the structure of the industry. If there was a vertical integration, there'd be a lengthening of the operating season to provide a better utilization of capacity and return on investment. So you could lengthen out the season and potentially, once again, have a better utilization of the harvesting capacity that you have, as well as the processing sector. Better quality raw materials to facilitate production of higher value products. One of the interesting things, once again, coming out from the MOU document, and if you look at what's happening in the fishery, because of the resource constraints, i.e. we don't have as much product as seafood and species and all the other things that are coming out because of climate change and other elements that are changing in the fishery, is that the Newfoundland Labrador fishery traditionally has been defined by high output because we have really, really good harvesters and really good fishermen, but relatively low quality. What you're seeing in the global marketplace now is more looking at higher quality, lower output. So people will pay more for good quality seafood. At the same time, getting that high quantity, which we've had in the past, will become more and more difficult as time evolves. And then finally, if you did have vertical integration, avoiding the transaction costs relating to buying from independent harvesters at many landing points and trucking the catch to plant for processing as well. All we have to do is see the price of gas these days and how much it costs to run a truck or run a car, and you can see once again it's quite a significant cost. The principal advantages of keeping horizontal integration in the fishery is that you keep that corporate concentration lower. So we won't have, once again, it just keeps the status quo. In an ideal world, what theory and what management practice tells you is that smaller organizations are better able to adapt to change. So you can use, once again, if you have these big companies, they don't adapt to change as well as smaller ones. Smaller, more flexible organizations mean you can go in an ideal world on different times and in different places. And harvesters, once again, control the licenses and quotas. There's more assurance and risk avoidance than in the processors holding the quota as well. So if we go back and ask the question, did the fleet separation policy work? We see significant demographic and population changes, not just in Newfoundland. We see an urbanization that's going on. Now, is that just related specifically to the policy? No. But once again, all you have to do is look at it in terms of the last census, in terms of rural communities in decline. Not all rural communities in decline. We were in the Codroy Valley today. We saw, I think Lynn was telling us there's been a 10% jump in terms of population there. But we do see increased urbanization. The MOU process and the numbers, the financial numbers that came out from there, once again, it's not a perfect set of data because it's only one year rather than the 5 or 10 years that you'd like to have. But in terms of what Deloitte found in terms of harvesting, they see between 1/3 and 2/3 of the fish harvesting operations currently operating in Newfoundland are viable, depending on the viability measure employed. So only once again, there's not a huge number of fish harvesting operations that are currently viable. On the processing side, the level of profitability is well below what elsewhere in the country, and the profitability level is not sufficient in the Newfoundland processing sector on average to make secure capital investments and achieve long-term viability. Basically, people are unwilling to invest in the processing sector because of the uncertainty of supply, and you're seeing plants once again either not operating or operating or not having any new investment as a result. So, the world has changed in the last 30 years since the policy. I just like to get these pictures. So that was the Walkman came out 30 years ago. Mork and Mindy, for those people who remember, was the top TV program. 3 Mile Island, remember that? That happened 30 years ago. Disco was really, really important. And this just happened in the news, but this poor little boy who was the first one who was ever on a milk carton 30 years ago, once again, he disappeared. The world has also changed in the fishery since the 1970s. Once again, as Mike was saying, we've seen huge technological changes. We've seen the change in the resource. We've seen the change in terms of the way that the resource is harvested and processed at the same time. So, 30 years ago, there was a dependence on groundfish, and now there's a dependence on shellfish. You saw primary market was the United States. Now we see markets in the US, Europe, Japan, Canada, niche. 30 years ago, it was pretty cheap energy. Now we have fairly expensive energy. Baby boomers need jobs, high unemployment in rural areas. We can see from the demographic shift, especially in the province, is that baby boomers are close to retirement and out migration from rural areas as well. This is a great, this comes from the Center for Fisheries Innovations at the Marine Institute, but it's amazing to look at the size of the Newfoundland fishery in terms of exports, and then we look at who we're actually selling to and their bargaining power. Walmart is so much off the chart that they can't even be there, but Costco, we've all heard of Costco. They're already about 70 million compared to us, which are 70,000 compared to not even on the map in terms of Newfoundland and Labrador fish exports as well. So you're selling to much, much bigger, whether it's processed or it's unprocessed, etc. You're selling to the relative bargaining powers of customers has increased significantly as well. And once again, Newfoundland and Canada is a much smaller player in the global fishery than was in the past. China, for example, has come on stream. Vietnam, Chile, Indonesia, Russia, Thailand. The whole, once again, the nature of the people or nature of the countries that are actually doing the fish harvesting and processing has changed dramatically. And this just, it's changed even more since 2008. So one of the problems that you see, and I think, once again, if we look at why there is a divorce, that there's a whole bunch of other issues as well, is that the industry participants, the processors and the harvesters, the goals are not aligned. And they want different answers to fundamental questions. So you see this business versus government versus the FFAW. Harvesters versus processors versus distributors versus consumers. You see harvesters versus harvesters. Huge amounts of competition in terms of getting the resource. And processors versus processors as well. So there's huge, huge, huge amounts of competition going on. Decision making is highly politicized. And ultimately, if we look at both the harvesting and the processing being a business, is that, once again, that's not a great environment for operating a business successfully if you're always worried in terms of what's going to happen politically as well. But community viability ultimately depends on being a business and making profits and being able to generate sufficient return on investment so that people want to invest in it and people want to invest in whether it's harvest, or whether it's new vessels or new processing plants, etc. So competition must be re-focused from internal to external. We need a shared vision of the future and the shared goals as well. So once again, is the fleet separation the cause or symptom? The symptoms, we see excess capacity as we saw in the MOU process. Everyone is scrambling to get enough raw material, usually to pay debts on vessels or pay their operating costs, make sure they get a reasonable living, etc. There's a lack of assured supply of raw material. The huge amounts of uncertainty. The fishery in and of itself, whether it's processing, harvesting, etc., is enormously a risky business. There's low return on investment in both harvesting and processing. So the effort is not normally coordinated through the value chain. So you're seeing a loss of output value. And where you're seeing it in the comparison, especially in other parts of Newfoundland and Labrador, you're seeing aquaculture, which is more vertically integrated. There's high requirements for working capital in the capture fisheries, both in the processing and the harvesting side, and there's excessive costs as well. Ultimately, you want to achieve, if you could achieve, you want to achieve coordination between the harvesters and the processors to make sure that the seafood or the product is coming in, it's being processed, and it's being done in a way that's benefit to both parties. So the ownership of the entire chain is one way to address these issues, but it's not necessarily so. So there has been, once again, people say vertical integration is key, but you can just see the Kirby Task Force in the 1984 restructuring show that, once again, it may not be the ideal solution. So what are the things, how are we doing for time, Mike? We're good. We're good? Excellent, okay. So in terms of looking at what the options are right now, status quo is keep the current policy. The issues are the MOU indicated that not many harvesters are making an adequate return on investment. Okay? There's a fair amount of what I would call subsistence living, and all you have to see, especially in this region when we were turning around, people who would rather go to Fort McMurray or go to other places and work there rather than working in the fishery. Living off previous investments, there was huge amounts of investment in the fishery, especially in the inshore fishery in the 1990s when the crab licenses were issued. Has there been a lot of investment since then? Questionable. The political climate also may shine spotlight on subsidies such as EI programs as well. Once again, since we've become a have province, the question is that can we keep the EI subsidies going into the fisheries as well? So will that be questioned by the Harper government? That's a question. The second option would be to eliminate the policy. But the issues is the slippery slope. You get these speculators potentially out there. You get low-cost crews. Earle's probably going to give you some really good examples of that, but that's an issue. One potential option, and this is what I always like to try and end and say, okay, what could be a solution to this, would be almost a hybrid fleet policy. So by doing this, you say, look, is there a way of actually opening up ownership to both processors and harvesters at the same time? So what you would do here is you would open up the fishing licenses up to potential investment, including the processors. Harvesters will still be in control. Investors can only have a non-controlling share. And once again, it doesn't necessarily have to be a processor. It can be anybody. You can be a doctor. You can be a lawyer, once again. But the harvester would still be in control. Set parameters around investors and licenses. Investors and harvesters still have to demonstrate ties to the province and to rural Newfoundland and Labrador. So you're not just seeing a whole bunch of people in St. John's owning these licenses. Focus on coordination, communication, and driving up value in the supply chain. So how do we take advantage of opportunities in terms of niche markets, in terms of competing on quality, not just competing on quantity, in terms of going forward? So what the envision would be that the harvesting fleet and the processor, but there'd be a shared investment. And once again, it could be either, the processor could have an investment in the harvesting fleet, and the harvesting fleet could have an investment in terms of the processor. Harvesters would still have control. The processor and other investors would be more involved. Less reliance on debt financing. Ideally, there'd be more equity. Economies of scale on the administrative side. So the owner-operator model that we see in the harvesting sector, a lot of the owners have to spend huge amounts of time negotiating with buyers, negotiating with insurance companies, making sure that they manage just the operational elements of what is, in some cases, a fairly substantial business. And the benefits is that you would start to keep the supply constant. There'd be more coordination and cooperation, which I think is really, really important if we're going to take advantages of opportunities in the capture fisheries. The sharing of information. Once again, when you have ownership, you more than likely what the management theory tells you is that you have shared information. Better investment in fleet, less distressed selling because of so much pressure on time to deliver. Higher working capital that's going to be involved because of this investment. Ultimately lead to higher quality, and when we look at it from a risk-based perspective, a lower risk as well. So the alternatives, once again, if we look at the best case, if we keep the status quo, in an ideal world, the fishery resource improves, significant investment emerges. The worst case, the captive fishery disappears from most of rural Newfoundland and Labrador because, once again, of a lack of investment and of a lack of potential in terms of the resource. You eliminate the policy. The best case is the market dictates the high value becomes to them for a few. The worst case is the slippery slope. Like, once again, you're going to have some people who can be driving up speculation, as we see in British Columbia. You could have people working on working in vessels who basically are just kind of the lowest cost provider. The hybrid alternative would be ultimately a change in the industry culture and cost increases and the lack of the worst case there would be some additional costs incurred by both the harvester and the processor to deal with this and a lack of control as well. So we have, when you look at, and especially looking through the MOU document and looking at all the things that have been discussed in the fishery, we can see that change is occurring. So either the industry, both the harvesters and the processors, need to take ownership of the process, or it'll just happen by default. I think that's the big thing that hopefully this session and other sessions like it discuss, that instead of DFO dictating this is what the policy is going to be, having once again people from the ground up saying this is what the policy could be and this is what it should be. The industry has tremendous opportunities, so, and I think both on the harvesting and the processing side, but you can't take advantage of them with the present industry structure, including a strict fleet separation policy. You're just going to have, once again, there's going to be these misaligned goals. The changes in industry depends heavily on changes in public policy. Okay, so once again, you got to start to look at some of these policies and processes. The substantial opportunities available, plus changing demographics, offer potential for change in the public policy as well. And re-examining the fleet separation policy with all stakeholders involved before the policy is enforced upon harvesters and processors alike really is, in my opinion, the best way forward. So thank you very much for the opportunity to present. I'm honored and privileged that Earle is going to come up and probably shoot down most of what I said. But once again, it's I think ultimately as a Newfoundlander, I think the discussion and the debate needs to occur, and hopefully it can be something that looks in terms of what's going to be the best for rural Newfoundland and Labrador, what's going to be the best for everyone who lives here in the province, and those people interested in the fishery and invested in the fishery as well. So thank you very much once again. Thank you for all the people coming, and thank you for the Harris Center for the invitation.
Good evening, and I'd like to also say, thank the Harris Center for the invitation to participate here. It's been a while since I went to Mun, but I did back, I don't know how many people here remember Lord Taylor, but I was here in his I don't recommend we go back to having a British Lord come in to run the university. Mike mentioned that, about me having been a little bit prominent around. I went into the DFO building recently. I've probably been down there in my time, I don't know, 500 times, I suppose, and security guard, when I came in one day recently, nice sunny day, he said, "Hello, Mr. McCurdy, how are you getting on today? Lovely day." And I said, "Yeah, indeed it is." And I said, "How are you?" And he was fine. And they said, "Now, Mr. McCurdy, you're going to need some photo ID. No, I'm not exactly technologically, I think the fax is a newfangled machine, but anyway, I'll do the best I can here with this. I always sort of regarded these things as a crutch for the insecure, but anyway, I decided in recent years to try and use them. They do come in handy. And with the fleet separation policy, I'll try not to duplicate what Tom's already said. It did come in for, really it was a separation between the harvesting and processing sectors in the what was then the under 65-foot fleet. There's now more flexibility vessel size-wise, so they can go up to 89, but it's basically that same fleet. So really, there was two sets of rules put in place at the time. The corporate fishery, which was at the time was for the most part offshore trawlers. There were a few at a smaller level, and then the under 65-foot fleet had the fleet separation policy with a grandfathering as a point of interest of the handful of grandfathered licenses that were corporate licenses under 65 feet. My recollection is that most of them were actually based right here in Port Basques. T.J. Hardy had a fleet of boats. Something tells me there was 12 or so, but I might have the number wrong. But in any event, there were several anyway that were actually company boats, and they were there's only, I think, there's 5 others over in Bonavista, and that was about it in this province. But eventually, those licenses were sold sort of one by one, as I understand it, to individual. In a lot of cases, captains who had operated on behalf of the company, and to my understanding, there's none of them still held. I think they've all been sold. So the one change that was done recently, and recently was in his book in the last couple of years or last year or so, was to amend the policy to allow a corporation to hold a fishing license in the owner-operator fleet. On the condition that it was that company was 100% owned by an individual harvester who was personally qualified to hold a license in his own right, i.e. was a level 2, had a level 2 designation from the Professionalization Board. In recent years, in an attempt to strengthen the fleet separation policy, the federal government implemented what's called PIFCAF, Preservation of the Independence of the Inshore Fleet in Canada's Atlantic Fisheries. And really what that was a process to set up a deadline for people to get out from under what were called controlling agreements. And a controlling agreement was one in which a license holder had a contract with another individual, often but not exclusively fish processors, in which control over the license actually was signed away from the individual license holder to somebody else. And it was that control over the license that made it a controlling agreement. Quite separately from that, there's what's sometimes referred to as a supply agreement, where a harvester would get financing from a processor in return for a commitment to ship his product to that processor. And there's nothing about that violates that PIFCAF arrangement. Now, I'm not a real expert on Alice in Wonderland, but I think it was the Queen of Hearts who said words mean what I say they mean, or something like that. I don't know if any experts in that matter, correct me if I got that a bit wrong. But the DFOs use the word modernization as a heading for a policy review that's currently underway. And in a sense, it's sort of hard to be against modernization, I suppose, but I'm wondering what's so modern about it, I guess. And they've said that, well, everything is on the table under questioning. They had this document that really they circulated, and you can look it up on their website, and it says almost nothing. It's a very innocuous, namby-pamby kind of document, consisting mostly of words that are entirely subjective. Their meaning is what any individual wants to put to them. So they say, like, they talk about prosperity. Well, anyone who's opposed to prosperity, please stand up. Everybody's for prosperity, especially especially my own, right? Or your own. Who doesn't believe in that? And sustainability. Well, again, there's no sense of a link between those words, which are fine-sounding words, and the outcome. So my question I asked myself when I read the document was, do they stand for nothing? Are there no kind of pillars on which you base a policy review? Is it based on, does it start from scratch with a blank page, or do you have some core principles? There was kind of the format for engaging online was terrible. They asked what policies you're against, with no opportunity to register what policies you're in favor of. Very leading questions, and which I think kind of were set up to get a particular outcome. In the document, the discussion document that went with that was the core or the kind of the starting point of that review, there wasn't a single mention of coastal communities. Wasn't in there once. But my contention that it's the owner-operator fishery that maintains the link between the resource and the adjacent coastal communities. And I'll try to kind of explain that as I go through. Because really, I guess the starting point of any policy discussion, when I said, do they stand for anything, is, well, for what purpose or in whose interest do we manage fish resources? Are they simply something to trade in the stock market, like futures and pork bellies, or something like that? Are they, or what do you call them? What was that one? Brex shares or something like that? Is that what is similar to that? Or Exxon shares? Because people from time to time will say, well, when you hear the host of the fisheries broadcast use the comparison with the Williams supermarket on Pleasant Street when that closed down. Well, I used to go into Williams supermarket when I was a kid too, but it really isn't a very apt comparison for the fishery that's the the basis of the economy, such as it is in our coastal communities. So really, you have to, in order to set specific policies, you have to have some idea in mind, it seems to me, of what's the goal of the policies. Or do we go out and say, well, if you just throw out a complete blank sheet, which appears to be how they're presenting it? Quite frankly, I don't think there's a blank sheet behind their thinking at all. I think they've got a predetermined outcome in mind. That's not going to be, if it transpires, a good one for our communities. But fishery is the mainstay of our coastal communities. And if you think about tourism, which is no question, we've done, it's been a growth industry, it's an important industry in the province. We've done, by all standards, a marvelous, I think it's widely accepted that the province has done a marvelous job promoting tourism. My view is it could be even marvelouser if they included into that advertising references to the fishery. Like, for example, in the month of April, you might say lobster season opens tomorrow, and just stick a little thing in the ad, if anyone's buying, that is. And but there's not a whole lot of interest in people coming. A scattered person might want to go see a ghost town, but I don't think that's the real guts of your tourist trade. They want to see something interesting. People want to see a little something they can't get at home when they travel. And fishery, I've talked to any number of people from outside the province who come here and putt it around the coastline, and they're just absolutely fascinated by it. But it's the basis in the fishery that makes it interesting. And the history of our fishery, fish was allocated. Well, for the longest time, there was no regulation effectively. You might have a regulation on mesh size you can use in a cod trap, or how many fathoms of salmon net you could have, or stuff like that. But you didn't need a license. There was no quotas for the longest time. For most of our history, that was the case. But eventually, in the second half of the 20th century, we got into things like quotas and limited entry through licensing policy and so on. But still, up until fairly recently, it was on competitive fisheries. So you'd have an opening date, and there's no such thing as leasing or peddling quota to somebody else or anything. If you were in the fishery, you had a boat, you untied it, you went and caught fish, and you were as good as your ability to do so. And so all people had was a right to go do it. Mostly small boats, fish was landed locally, and that generated economic activity in the local area. And access was based. The traditional pillars of access to fish, going back over many years, was adjacency and historic dependence. If you're alongside the resource and or had a history of participating in a particular fishery. Those were the pillars for access to resource for a long time. That would be, and that's the inshore fishery we're talking about here. Now, in the corporate fishery, that was greater than 65-foot fleet, and for the most part, we're talking offshore trawlers, 150-foot plus vessels. No owner-operator fleet separation policies. And unlike the inshore fishery, where licenses are held within regions, one of the regions being Newfoundland Labrador region, and can't be transferred out of those regions, which kind of keeps that resource in a particular region. In the offshore sector, they're Atlantic-wide, so they can be transferred. Out. And some of the recent controversy over OCI, I think, bears out some of the consequences of privatization of the resource, because the offshore sector, going back into the early 80s, about 82 or 83, when the offshore sector was virtually bankrupt and was at the time saved by a fairly substantial government bailout, both federal and provincial, they implemented a system called enterprise allocations, which was company quotas of fish. Prior to that, there'd be an overall quota, and you're going to go off on January 1st or whenever the opening date was, and everybody would fish until the quota was caught. And at one time, we had about 80 deep-sea trawlers in the province. But when they set up these individual company quotas, there was no requirement with that that they be used in any manner that would be consistent with the public good. It's just people had a quota and they could do as they saw fit with it within within certain rules. The province only has jurisdiction over fish essentially when it touches land. But at that point they do. So they implemented back quite a number of years ago what are called minimum processing requirements aimed at trying to get value added onshore out of our fish, which was a controversial policy, no doubt, but nonetheless one that has been there for quite some time. But once you can actually, there's a real danger to having a piece of paper that says that people get this sense that now that's my fish, as opposed to it's a public resource and I get a crack at it. And if I'm any good and I get up off my ass in the morning, get cracking, I'll get my share and hopefully enough to make a decent living on. That's how the fishery was. But now it's getting more and more based on having a piece of paper that has a number attached to it. And here's how much fish I can fish. And next thing you know, someone says, aha, that's mine. And I should be able to do with that as I see fit. And then next thing you're into wheeling and dealing. And the current OCI management is actually it's only the second corporate entity, but really the third, for all practical purposes, the third group that had that same set of fishing privileges, which are kind of hence some suite of fishing privileges. 2 offshore scallop licenses, or no, several offshore, I can't remember the number, offshore scallop licenses, 2 offshore shrimp licenses, roughly 40% of the groundfish quotas in Atlantic Canada. That, unfortunately, at the moment is a relatively low absolute number because of the resources are at a low level. But nonetheless, it's quite a suite of privileges. The original FPI held those, that was really put together in the early 80s following the near collapse of the deep sea sector that I referred to earlier, and was put together out of the ashes of several previous offshore companies. But then there was a hostile takeover of OCI by the group headed up by John Risley back about 11 or 12 years ago. And then, of course, that group sold out to OCI almost 5 years ago. Problem is, every time these companies change hands, the real value is in that piece of paper that says you can catch X amount, you have two offshore shrimp licenses with so much quota attached, you have this license, you have that license, and that's where the real value is, more so than in any hardware. And each time they change hands, the price goes up, and that attaches a whole lot of debt load to that enterprise, which has to be satisfied somehow. In addition to the debt associated with buying buying hardware, boats and plants and so on, equipment, you also have a huge debt load over time built up acquiring quota. And I would suggest if you ask the car dealers and the furniture dealers and so on around the local economy which fishery really supports the local economy, I would suggest that the most common answer you get would, in fact, it would be the inshore owner-operator fishery. There we go. Now, I've always told our crowd that if you don't eat your broccoli, you'll end up like the crowd in BC, because the British Columbia fishery, for the people who actually go out and catch fish, is a disaster. For the people who can wheel and deal in quotas and lease out their quotas, it works quite handsomely, thank you. But for the people who actually catch the fish, and I've talked to a lot of them, they don't have an owner-operator or fleet separation policy, as Tom indicated earlier. So leasing of quota is widespread. And so if you have a fishery in which you're directed fishery, you have a certain amount of inadvertent bycatch that you can't avoid. And particularly if that bycatch happens to be halibut or something, an expensive fish, and you don't have quota for it, then somebody who has quota to offer can extort a huge percentage of the value of that fish from you, because if you don't get your hands on some halibut quota, you can't go fishing, because you have to have a quota to cover off your bycatch. So, and I talked to one guy, for instance, who went to see his guys operating a fishing vessel, has been doing so for a long time and trying to survive at it, and he went to see his dentist. And his dentist said, what kind of year did you have? The dentist knew he was a fisherman, he'd known him for years. What kind of year did you have last year? He said, geez, it was terrible. We survived by the skin of our teeth. And the dentist said, that's funny, I had a good year. And the dentist was actually a quota holder. He never operated a fishing boat in his life, never participated in the fishery, other than he held quota and peddled it around and extracted the value. And the communities there really have been decimated. Now that's, I was going to say difficult, but I think impossible is probably a better description to read. That's a settlement sheet from a trip of fish in British Columbia, and I'll just touch on the highlights very briefly. The figure here, that shows the different species of fish, how much halibut of this size and that size, how much cod you got, etc. That figure there is the gross landing of the stock. And round numbers, $113,000. It's a 10-day trip in a longliner, 50-odd foot boat, I believe it was. The boat share towards capital costs and depreciation, those kinds of things, out of almost $113,000 was $4,200, which for anyone who's operated a boat knows that that's not sustainable. That's just not enough money to be putting back into your, if that was the norm, there's no way in the world. There's two figures there in kind of it was pink, but it kind of looks purple there. The halibut quota fee that person had to pay to lease halibut for the right opportunity to go fishing, and the person who's the recipient of this, the operating the fishing vessel, has all the expense of the boat, the insurance, the fuel, the bait, the crew, all that is on him. Halibut quota fee, $73,000. Cod quota fee was just under $9,000. So that's a total of about $82,000 out of 113 in round numbers gone in quota fees to people who don't have boats, don't have the expense of operating, but have that piece of paper that they can shop around. The total actual trip expenses, which was things like fuel, bait, grub, the normal expenses anyone operating a fishing vessel will be familiar with, was about $15,000. License fees of $3,100. The net that was left to pay the crew out of $113,000 was $7,700. Individual share, this figure here, is this guy's share. There's his name, it's his share. Out of that amount of shrimp, of fish for, and a lot of halibut, which is a valuable fish, for 10 days at sea, $1,289. That's what the guy got. Now he's the one who's risking life and limb to go out and get it. So we don't want to end up like that. And when people talk about, saying modernizing, what they mean by that, if that's modern, I'll settle for old-fashioned. Thanks all the same. The other place that's often cited as some kind of a model to strive for is New Zealand. They say, look what a marvelous job they've done with their ITQ system in New Zealand. ITQs being individual transferable quotas. They had a radical deregulation of their entire economy, including their fishery, back in the 80s. It was a real free market mentality, and they went into, among other things, corporate ITQs, individual transferable quotas, took out the lines between fleets so somebody in a big boat could buy quota from someone in a small boat, and very quickly, small boat enterprises got marginalized, and the coastal communities became disconnected from the fishery. They couldn't even get the fish to eat that they'd grown up with because all that was being caught on big boats and shipped elsewhere for processing. And very quickly, the corporate offshore sector gained control over their quotas, set the lease fees, and so on. There was so much cost associated with leasing quota and peddling quota and so little left to pay the crew, very similar to what happened in BC, that it became difficult to find New Zealanders who would work on those boats because the money wasn't there for it. So you had an upswing in what they call foreign chartered vessels. There's currently a ministerial inquiry going on in New Zealand. There was a scandal which was unearthed by Bloomberg News Service, which is a fairly conservative. It's not exactly some flaming left-wing outfit. It's a stock market news reporting service, very conservative. And then they had this expose on a slavery scandal, effectively, on New Zealand fishing vessels. To the great embarrassment of the country, because New Zealand is thought of as a pretty civilized place. And this is the CEO of one of their deep sea companies said, if a company's only rationale to make money is to pay slave rates of 50 cents an hour, they should leave the fish swimming. And the deep sea operation manager of the same company said, what this inquiry is investigating are true accounts of modern day people trafficking, slavery, fraud, lies, and deception. He should have already said what he was really thinking. so what you actually have in New Zealand, and by the way, don't take my word for it, Google it. Just Google slavery on New Zealand fishing vessels or something like that, and or Bloomberg Business Service, New Zealand fishery, something like that, anything at all, and it was no trouble at all to come up with some of these reports. They actually have a situation now. This is quite common on a lot of their fish, not all of it, but a lot of their fish. That's caught on Korean or Chinese vessels or other foreign vessels, crewed by third world crews, Indonesian in many cases, or Filipino or whatever. The stuff is taken to China for processing, and it's exported to North America or Europe. Now, I look at that, and I'm trying to figure out where the New Zealand benefit is in all that. Like, how does that fish is swimming along their shores, and where does the benefit come to New Zealand? And I guess the next question is, what reason we got to think that we'd end up any differently if we went down that road? My view is that that's the inevitable result of a radical deregulation of the fishery. It's kind of like the fishing equivalent of subprime loans. And I don't think there's anything modern at all about that. I got a couple of just kind of closing comments. My view is that the deepest pockets who has the deepest pockets shouldn't replace the old cornerstones of adjacency and historic dependence as the basis of access to fish resources. Advocates of it use an entirely phony argument that an ITQ fishery is more conservation oriented. And when I say it's phony, I guess I got to back that up. Well, I just look at there's I think 14 or 15, 14 is the number sticks in my mind, groundfish stocks in Atlantic Canada that were closed for extended periods under moratorium because of resource depletion. Every single one of them was managed, at least in part, and some of them entirely, under an ITQ regime. Our lobster fishery, on the other hand, is not even a quoted fishery, let alone an individual quoted fishery. It's managed on input controls, pot limits and numbers of licenses and so on, and has thrived. It has ups and downs. Any resource does naturally. That's just the way the world is. But has generally thrived without all those trappings of a privatized fishery. The ITQ argument really is about ideology. And the government we have in Canada right now is very ideological. And it's really what they're proposing is a radical deregulation like some countries did with the banks a few years ago. And what could possibly go wrong? Well, other than the collapse of the world economy, perhaps. But anyway, I think that that's something to be very concerned about and on guard about. The survival of coastal communities, in my estimation, is directly linked to the continuation of an owner-operator fishery based on the fleet separation policy. By all means, I think there's all kinds of policy change that we could engage in and could simplify things and could make the fishery function more. I think there's a real opportunity to do that associated with the demographic change with the baby boomer generation starting to leave the workforce. I think it was a real disappointment and a lost opportunity when the provincial government threw the MOU in the garbage can, because I believe there was potential there to help move to the next generation in a more organized and coordinated fashion. But I believe the pillars need to remain in place for future policy. So that'll do it for me. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Earle. I'm going to ask Earle and Tom to come and sit in the front
chairs.
and to take your questions and your comments. Wonderful presentations by our two presenters.
I'll sit on the left.
And almost, if you look at it very quickly, you might say, well, they're at odds with each other. But I think they're maybe talking across each other. I think that I don't think Tom is saying that we need to go the route of New Zealand and privatize everything. I don't think that's what you're saying, Tom. And Earle, I don't think you're disagreeing that there are problems with the current policy as it exists. So is there some kind of a middle ground that could be achieved? Can the policy be amended in some way without throwing it out the window altogether? That would be one approach to things. So anyway, we're going to turn it over to you guys. And as I mentioned earlier, for those who are watching on the internet, they will want to hear your question or your comment. So we're going to circulate a wireless microphone that John has over here. And I wonder, Amy, if you would circulate it around the room. And so if you want to ask a question or make a comment, just raise your hand and we'll get the microphone over to you. The first question is always the toughest one to ask. Well, let me, while you're rummaging your question, let me just ask Earle if, Earle, you probably agree that the policy as it is now is not perfect. There's probably gaps in it. Is there anything that you would change in it without throwing it out the window altogether?
I think I'd look to areas other than the fleet separation policy to effect change, because I think that's more of that's kind of just a pillar for the overall management of the fishery, and the head of the Association of Seafood Producers is fond of saying, or appears to be anyway, because he says it frequently in any event, that, well, where's the owner-operator fishery got us? We got the lowest birth rate in the Western world. And I'm struggling with the cause and effect relationship there, because I'm not sure that the case is made by simply saying that the two are related. But I think it's easy to put a lot on, because let's face it, a lot of the problems we got in our fishery still, we had hundreds of thousands of tons of fish, and we built a fishery on the strength of that huge amount of what we thought. We thought it would last forever, and obviously we thought wrong, and it got depleted, and we're paid a terrible price since. So a lot of the problems that we have today in the fishery are really the unfinished business of the moratorium on the different species. I mean, you're here now with I was driving down today, just thinking about when we used to come down here for the winter fishery, and just the tremendous amount of fish that came in across the wharf. Or you think of all the people there, guys in down around Rose Blanche, who used to go down to St. Pierre Bank fishing with hook and line and catch £1 million a year on hook and line, or some phenomenal figure like that. I mean, there's no question. There was in the day there was a tremendous good fishermen do that, but we had this fish to work with, and we built up communities and workforces and numbers of license holders on the strength of that, and we've been trying to muck through ever since on not nearly enough to go around, and that's why I thought the aging of the population presented an opportunity that I had hoped the MOU would seize on, and say, how can we come out of it with fewer people and without this huge burden of debt that caused so many problems in places like not only in places like New Zealand, but don't need to look any further than OCI. I mean, that $158 million was the figure they paid to acquire the primary assets of that company. And quite frankly, I think that's at the root of a lot of the problems they've had since, is just how in the world do you pay off that much debt out of a fishing company.
I'm just wondering, with looking at the lobster and what the FFAW is looking at doing in terms of forming a co-op and selling it, is that not vertical integration on the part of the fishers? And is that viable in the long run? I mean, is that not going to squeeze out plant workers and plant owners? Well,
the lobster fishery doesn't have much in the way of processing. I think Mr. Osmond's plant there is probably the only one that I know of anyway that has actually a processing aspect to their lobster. So it's not a fishery where you have it's essentially a live market with you collect it and ship it out for the most part as is. So it's a different fishery that way. A co-op is certainly, I would argue, a different piece of business than if an individual. I mean, in terms of an individual fisherman going into the plant section, or operating a processing plant, I'd look on that the same way as a processor going to go into the harvesting side. I think that the line is a fair ball, but the cooperative, I think, is a different structure altogether. I look at Fogo Island Co-op, for example, in 1969. Had that not been formed, the community would have been long since resettled, because the corporate operator there gave up on it, and there's nobody else, and they either got together and did their own thing, or they went out of existence and just moved off the island. That was their choice, and 43 years later, they're still there.
So I guess the major difference, Earle, there is that the profits remain with the members. They're not.
It's a collective structure. The Labrador Fishermen's Union Shrimp Company is effectively a co-op. It's held by fishermen on the coast of Labrador on the basis of one vote per individual harvester, and they have a policy. They're actually set up as a corporation, not a co-op, but they have one of their bylaws that the maximum dividend they pay is $1 a year per shareholder. So what that means is they put their money back into the company, and they've maintained a presence. I mean, the coast of Labrador today, had that not taken place, would be a shambles. Bank of Montreal was down there, and they weren't making enough money. You know, they weren't generating the profit they thought they needed to continue to operate. So they just pulled out. The only bank on the coast, and which was a real crisis at the time. And the shrimp company had the financial strength to put a significant amount of money in as seed capital for the Eagle River Credit Union, which is now the financial institution on the coast of Labrador. Again, it's a people's institution. Any profit realized goes back into the company. They've expanded. They're all over the coast, and a godsend for people there, because other than that, there'd been no banking. They would have had to try and do it long distance.
Did that answer your question, or okay? Tom, what kind of guarantee could you put in place? Sometimes, if you say, well, we're going to review a policy, what would prevent this review from ending up to the point of saying we're going to go the New Zealand route? As soon as you open something up, is there not a danger that things are going to go too far?
See, I thought about that, and I thought, so there's a risk of that, and that's what I mean by the slippery slope. There's a risk that could happen. But you always want to have a control against that, and that's this person sitting next to me. So the FFAW has been very, very successful as a union, very, very successful in terms of making sure that fishermen's and fishers' rights and livelihoods have been protected. And I think that's maybe, and Earle, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's the difference in that you have a strong union presence here in Newfoundland. You didn't have that in New Zealand. You didn't have that to a great extent in British Columbia as well. So the union acts as a counterbalance to that potential risk. So in terms of,
they had a pretty good union going in British Columbia, but in the absence of that policy, the erosion of the clout of the people actually catch the fish was very hard
in British Columbia,
very hard to stop.
One of my family members we used to be involved in the fishery in British Columbia, and like Earle said, there's been a lot of people who've had to exit, or they're not making a substantial living. And what you've seen is some people, like Earle's indicating, has made a lot of money. That's not really consistent with, I would think, here in Newfoundland and Labrador in terms of the way we go about the fishery. I think once again, it's in terms of how do we get that coordination and cooperation between those two different sectors to take advantage of the opportunities. And I think that's the key thing that hopefully I'm trying to take across. But there's a gentleman back there with a question.
And I'll just make a comment that the fact that they didn't have that policy in BC probably weighed against them, whereas at least you're starting with a policy here in Atlantic Canada.
Yeah, well, and I think in terms of making money, geez, that's presumably the goal of people in business, whether you're operating a fishing vessel, a fish plant, or a corner store, or a pizza parlor. But the problem with the rules they have in British Columbia is there's people who aren't involved in fishery whatsoever who are making the money, and the people actually get their hands dirty and are really get the crumbs.
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
I'm John Peters. I'm professor of political science at Laurentian. I'm a complete outsider in terms of the fisheries, but I do know labor issues, and I also have some sense about how economics works and how big corporations work. I guess, Tom, you were trying to make the argument that if you became bigger, companies are going to be more successful. But certainly, as Earle pointed out, I mean, there's real problems, especially in an industry that's sort of based on sustainability and managing that sustainability. And what happens, of course, is that the bigger the companies, it seems, and it strikes me, is that we're talking about inshore, but what seems to be happening offshore is that the companies have become very large. And overfishing seems to be pretty widespread. And the nature of the quota system seems to be causing all kinds of problems. So I'm guessing, if you're arguing to say that bigger is going to be better. Why isn't necessarily bigger been better in terms of sustainability on the offshore? I guess that'd be one problem. And I think for Earle, if your model about owner-operator works for inshore, what do you think, or what kinds of regulations and policies do you think should be in place for trying to regulate the offshore, which is having these problems around sustainability in the long term?
Sure. Great question. Thank you very much. I don't think, once again, I think there's going to be different models that are going to work for different types of fisheries, and it's going to work for different areas of the province as well. I don't want to say that big is always better. In some cases, you may have niche providers, you may have smaller providers, you may have medium-sized providers. I guess, both on the processing sector and on the harvesting sector. I think what the problem with the fleet separation, it doesn't even give you the opportunity to strategically say what you want to do. And I think from a sustainability standpoint, I'd rather have, once again, trying to say what are the opportunities so we can fish certain species more sustainably. And having to go out because of the huge amounts of debt, because of, frankly, there's not a huge amount of equity investment in the fishery right now, and everybody going out at the same time, trying to catch as much as they possibly can, because the processors need it to pay off, their debt loads and pay off all the bills that they've accrued over the year. Same thing with the harvesters. They need to go out and pay off all the debts that they've accrued over the year. It just leads to kind of, let's go out and try and get as much fish as quickly as possible, which to me, whether it's crab or whether it's shrimp, etc. I think, once again, if we could think about a different way in terms of approaching it, where, once again, if you had this more shared ownership, I think it could be a potential better solution than what we have now. So I take Earle's point that it's a pillar. My question is, can we maybe change the pillar around? So as Mike said, we're talking probably cross rather than not talking next to each other. But it is a very good point. Earle, I'll let you answer your part.
On the issue of the offshore sector, how to organize it. One of the issues with, like, in a lot of ways, I guess this coast doesn't have the same extent of individual quota fisheries as, say, the Northeast Coast has. But as you get into, then there's no question there are some advantages to a system of individual quotas, but there's also some very significant disadvantages. Because you get into that sense of, I own the fish and I can start chopping it around, which becomes problematic. But once you get into that and people buy quota, then that's very difficult to go back from that. And that's my concern. Once you get into that mode, it's kind of a one-way street. And I would argue, from a point of view of efficiency or any of the standards you might want to use to say is the fishery successful, you're hard pressed to make the argument that the vertically integrated offshore fishery in Atlantic Canada over the years has been a roaring success. I don't think the history says that. It's had good years, it's had bad, but I don't think there's anything you'd say that somehow has been a model to move to. I think it's tough to move off once it's entrenched because people have paid for something. And actually, one of the problems with the review of the fleet separation policy now is that there's a lot of people have invested a lot of money in inshore fishing operations who would be clearly prejudiced by a significant change in that policy, and they would justify, say, what the hell is going on? I bought under an assumption of a certain set of rules, and if you change that, I might end up with a pig in a poke.
We have a question from somebody watching on the internet, so I'll pass the microphone over to John.
I can just use that right here. I have actually a question from Winston Feinlander here. He says, directed towards Tom. He says, the business model is fine for managing an enterprise, but is it appropriate for managing a public resource? Won't the model advocated by you simply introduce more freeloaders into the industry and deprive legitimate participants from the benefits they derive from our public resource?
Okay. Thank you, Winston, for another good question. I think, once again, if you set the parameters around it so that, once again, they have to have some tie to the community, they have to have some tie to the fishery. They can't be the case of, as Earle was saying, of the dentist who never sat or never stepped on a fish boat or never been in a community where the fish is being processed or the fish is being landed. I think if you set the right parameters, you can avoid those cases of public freeloading. Once again, it's, what's the risk and is there a control? And yes, there's going to be a risk around that, but I think once again, you have some fairly strong advocates for, the people who once again are making, who are invested in the fishery, whether it's the processors or whether they're harvesters and be it captains or crew members, and also because of the people within the communities themselves. So I think once again, it's the parameters that are really, really important. And those parameters come through having the appropriate discussion and making sure that we, it's not just DFO who's saying this is what we're going to do, but instead that it's coming bottom up rather than top down.
Yeah, I guess I'm not sure if I've ever met a slope that wasn't slippery.
Yes.
But the, we've got a mindset in the DFO Ottawa bureaucracy which has met its match in the current federal administration of wanting to just deregulate. They've got not just deregulate, but radically deregulate. And that's the same mindset that took the shackles, or they took the restrictions off the banks, and ended up, the outcome in the banking sector was subprime loans, which made no sense from other than somebody with no, in the absence of any oversight, some bright light said, here's a way that we can get a quick buck out of it, even though it's disastrous for the economy as a whole. So you get stuff like a migrant worker making $14,000 a year in Arizona getting a $750,000 mortgage. You got that. Now it was only a matter of when the initial honeymoon period was over and the real mortgage payments kicked in. Of course, the thing got repossessed, and by that time, some sucker over in Germany had made an investment that ended up having to take the hit for that, because the poor old Mexican guy, he never could have afforded a house anyway, so he was back where he started. But that's the kind of stuff. So their mindset, in my view, is very much to deregulate. So when you say it's, oh yeah, okay, we'll put some restrictions attached, you got to live in the community, that's not what they see the role of government. They see the role of government as, I don't know, what is it, defense and geez, I'm not quite sure what else.
And just to follow on from that, my
taxation.
My fear or my risk is if you don't actually think about how to change around the policy, given that the way that the current Harper government is looking at things, they're going to say, okay, why do we continue on with our EI subsidy of the fishery, whereby people can work so many weeks a year and then get EI for the rest, all those sorts of things. And I think pretty much, and correct me if I'm wrong, Earle, but everything under that kind of regime everything's up for debate and everything's to be renewed. So how do you get around that? You say, well, here's a model we like. This is a model we think that's going to work. And I agree. A lot of slopes are slippery, but some of them kind of gently slope down. And so the question is, how do you make sure that you keep it a very gentle 1 degree gradient rather than a 40 or 50 degree gradient?
One thing we have to bear in mind, I think, with our fishery, there are those who will exaggerate the potential for taking the seasonality out of the fishery. There are some fisheries in which there's some potential to do that. Most of the fisheries that went into collapse were fished 52 weeks a year. Whether one caused the other, intuitively you think there's probably a relationship, but who the hell knows? Yeah. But if you look at the nature of our lobster or our crab, number of our fisheries, they don't really lend themselves to. You have issues of a certain time of year when they're molting or they're soft shell or they're this or they're that. You have ice covering in huge areas. There's a whole lot of considerations that say, to a fairly significant extent, this is going to be a seasonal industry. You might be able to expand I think one potential is to spread out the landings better over the operating season. You get some situations that are just hopeless. I mean, when you get the piddly little quotas, the groundfish we got in the Gulf, I mean, you just throw your hands up. What can you do with it? There's not enough to. Jesus, a bunch of us here in the room could practically eat the Gulf cod quota. I mean, it's in one sitting. So it's very, very difficult to manage those things. I mean, that's almost impossible. But you look back and say over the last 50 years, did it turn out well when we got into a year-round fishery? I don't think it did. Whether maybe the factors that caused it not to turn out well were something altogether different, but it make you wonder.
So, Earle, Tom made the comment that prosperity would increase if there was better coordination between the harvesters and the processors. And as this gentleman mentioned earlier, with the lobster co-op, there is coordination between the two. How would you see as being additional ways that there could be additional cooperation between the harvesting sector and the processing sector, without getting rid of the fleet separation policy? But are there ways where coordination could be increased?
Yes, I think there probably are. I think there are certainly areas of the fishery where we've had a fair bit of cooperation in how we manage it. Some better than others. I think it would be, if you were starting from, it's hard to overstate the difficulty connected with just the sheer numbers we got for a way smaller resource. And we've got in this, I know we probably only got, I don't know, a third of the active licenses or something we had, or a half or something, like a significant reduction, but not even close to the reduction there's been in the available resource. So you get a halibut fishery that lasts 24 hours. What the hell are you going to do with that? You get a turbot fishery that lasts 3 or 4 days. You get dribs and drabs of cod, in uneconomic quantities to do anything with, whether you're vertically integrated or not. The lack of volume is a brutal challenge in those fisheries. I think we've had examples in the shrimp fishery. We've had some pretty good cooperation. I think there's always room to do better in that regard. I think if we had a better balance between the size of the industry in terms of number of people trying to make a living from it, and that's everything from number of fishermen, number of buyers, number of plant workers, all of it, that was more in sync with the amount of resource we got available, a lot of those problems would be easier to tackle.
I agree.
Angela, question?
Hi there. Thanks very much. My name is Angela Carter. I teach at Grenfell Campus, Memorial University, just up the coast. And I have a question that's a little bit broader than the exact subject for this evening. Both of you referenced in different ways sustainability, talking about the resource itself. And it got me thinking about the work that I focus on. And of course, we're leading into a workshop now the Harris Center is doing tomorrow on the regional development or sustainability in general. My work is on oil and gas. I look at comparisons across Canada. And when I study Newfoundland and Labrador, for the most part, I've looked on the East Coast, 350 kilometers offshore, what's happening out there. But now, most recently, I've turned my attention to new developments happening off this coast and really close, about 70 kilometers offshore, a drilling site that's been proposed for oil. And I realize that there's a strategic environmental assessment that's about to happen, so there'll be public consultations with local people. Port of Basques is one of the sites where people are going to be, the government is going to be coming to ask for feedback. And I'm just wondering, is this something that is on the radar of people working in fisheries in this region? Reason why I ask is because I've been talking to people from other provinces in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, PEI, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Quebec, and there's a lot of fishery sectors, workers and leaders there that are getting really, really concerned. Of course, what we saw in the Gulf of Mexico and Prince William Sound when Exxon Valdez went down in 1989 was, you get an oil spill, you have a decimation of fisheries that, lasts for decades. So I'm just wondering, is this something that's on the radar for fisheries people here on this coast, or is it not yet something we're talking about?
I think there's concern about it wherever it is. I think in the province of Newfoundland, it would be pretty difficult to be opposed to the oil industry, period. I'd say, no, we shouldn't have any oil development because it has been a real boon for the province in a lot of ways. Having said that, I really believe there's an inadequate attention paid to the impact and the current impact and the potential impact of these developments on a sustainable or a renewable industry like the fishery. I had a chance a year and a half ago to spend a week down in Gulf of Mexico, mostly in Louisiana, but in 2 or 3 other states as well, meeting mayors and fishermen and plant operators and different people, oil industry people and so on, who different ways had been affected by that calamity down there, and it's scary. And now you see, when you start to see the federal government saying, this environmental review stuff, we don't need that, we don't need the half of that Gulf, let's get rid of some of that, and let's let industry regulate itself. the track record on that's not very good. That's what gave us the Walkerton water scandal, you know, and a lot of things. So, I mean, when I read that, I decided I wasn't going to buy any hot dogs this summer. Make you nervous, but but it is on the oil and gas. It is scary. The impact, the potential impact of what can happen. There's actually a really scary item I just read a couple of days ago of all news agencies, Al Jazeera, that I guess it's an Arabic based.
Yeah, it's equivalent to CNN for the Arab world.
Yeah. Anyway, they had this thing about sort of mutated fish and shellfish down in Gulf of Mexico, frighten the life out of you. But I think there's, we just closed down 2 positions in St. Louis. The federal government did. People who were responsible for oil and gas spill, response, and this whole deregulation mentality is stripping down our capacity to do stuff like that. That's important for the public good. So yeah, it is a concern. I've heard it said, and I just don't know. I'm not knowledgeable enough to say to comment on whether or not the movement of the tides and the movement of water and stuff like that in the Gulf poses a more kind of insidious arrangement than, say, the Grand Banks, where the flushing might be more effective. I don't know. I'm just not knowledgeable enough on that to say, but all that stuff would kind of give you the willies for sure. And I don't think there's enough there in terms of clear-cut compensation guidelines. I think the oil industry, I don't think, I really believe that there should be a separation in CNL OPB of the safety aspect, and they should have more of in mind the same what's in place in the event, because the risk of those developments is with the people who rely on the ocean for their living. And that's who, when we met them, the people who were the most devastated down in Louisiana were people who made their living from the sea, basically people involved in the fishery. And at least down there, they didn't have a limit on liability. Here, my understanding of what the federal government proposes would be quite very significant limits on the liability of people who could devastate our environment. Yeah, which in their world is chump change.
If I could get back to the fleet separation policy for a second. Earle, what would be your reaction if plant owners were allowed to purchase quotas? I mean, they're located in communities, they're dedicated to the fishery. Would you see that as being a problem?
Well, I think what you end up with, whenever somebody, whether it's a plant owner or a dentist or an NHL hockey player or anybody else, if somebody gets, I guess, why does somebody get the privilege of being allocated the right to catch fish? There's 30, I don't know what the latest number is, 30-some odd million people in Canada, and there's a few thousand fishing licenses. So it's not as though everybody can do it. And if the somebody who gets it is not somebody who then takes that and goes and fishes it, operates a fishing vessel, catches fish, and that's the basis of it, then I believe inevitably where that takes you is what that settlement sheet there showed on the screen. It might take a few years to get to that extreme, but I think it's inevitable. That's where they ended up, not only in BC, that's where they ended up in New Zealand. If you can take it, and it's a lot less costly and a lot less aggravating and a lot safer for your well-being to take that piece of paper and say, well, geez, that fishing racket, you got to get up early, there's rough work, it's demanding, and a boat is really expensive to operate, there's a tremendous amount of risk. I don't want any of that. I just want to make a buck, so I'll lease out that and I'll just hold a piece of paper.
Could it not be made non-transferable?
Why would you transfer? See, the thing with quota leasing is that as long as you can annually lease the quota, we had a debate, it was so-called buddy-up policy, which is really a quota leasing policy. So I got quota, and rather than operating a fishing vessel, which is an expensive proposition, it costs a lot of money, expensive to insure, it's expensive to operate, there's a lot of risk, there's a lot of sleepless nights, there's a lot goes with it. If I can get someone else to do that, and I can just simply peddle that every year. Well, sure, that's the goose that lays the golden egg. Why would I'd be out of my mind? So just think of if somebody got a quota of crab and they can get 100,000 pound quota of crab, for argument's sake. There's a number of longliners in the East Coast get somewhere in that ballpark. If you could go around, shop it around if you could peddle it around to whoever you get the most of, you could probably get close to $1 a pound for that. For someone, you find somebody who'd fish for that, even though it probably didn't make sense, but just either out of wearing their rose-tinted glasses when they shouldn't, or out of desperation, or whatever reason, somehow I think I can come out of it. Someone pay a lot, so you can get an annual. Well, or even if it's only 50 cents, you got somewhere between $50,000 and $100,000 coming in annually. How much would you have to get to sell that asset? $2 million? Something like that. Just anyone. I mean, something that'll generate you $50,000 to $100,000 a year, and you hold the asset as long as you want to hang on to it. I mean, you wouldn't transfer it other than, in fact, you get to the point, I suppose, to get a little bit of fish to catch, you end up having to go into Hoyle's Escazone or something and rent a bit of quota off someone, because why would somebody ever sell if you could annually shop those rates around to the highest bidder.
Gentleman in the back.
Hi, Roland King. My family owns a plant close by here in Burn Islands. Our family, my father owned the fishing license. He was a fisherman at first, and he ended up getting into a plant. So he had a pre-79 license, which the company eventually ended up having to move out because of the policy that came in afterwards. So we were one of the companies that held an inshore less than 65-foot license, as well as Billard's Fisheries here, that's now out of business in Marguerite. When someone asked a little while ago, I think it was the moderator himself, asked if a plant owner owning a license was a problem. I'm not so sure which way I fall on, and even though our company did own license in the past, I'm not sure which side I fall on that. Our company has dealt with inshore fishermen for a good many years, over 50 years, and we've always had a good relationship with our inshore fishermen. There's been a time when companies that have held offshore licenses with the ability to lease their quota to boats that are less than 65 feet, and we've lost the ability to purchase fish that was competitive, because in order for those vessels to obtain the ability to fish the offshore quota, they had to agree to bring their inshore quota to the plants as well. So there are some dangers there with that. But as far as vertical integration is concerned, there's certainly no obstacles in place right now for fishermen to own fish plants. So fishermen are they have the complete ability to vertically integrate themselves. The FFAW's latest co-op initiative is one of those things, but I can name several others. The plant in Cadroy before Mr. Osmond owned it was owned by a fisherman. The plant in Ramia was owned by a fisherman from St. John's, and there are several other instances of that around the island with no obstacles. So fleet separation really doesn't exist for fishermen.
Not from the ground up or the sea up.
Right. It does exist for plant owners. The other problem with having complete separation and fleet, in my opinion, of fleet separation is when quotas get to the point where the amount of quota that's available to a fisherman is no longer sustainable for that fisherman to operate his vessel. If he had the ability to buy or make arrangements with other fishermen around him to fish their quotas or fish their share of a quota, for example, in the case of a weekly limit, then it would make that operation more viable, and it would actually sustain communities.
And is that currently possible?
Currently, in the 3P and 4R area, there is a buddy up system, for example, available for codfish, but only one vessel. When you're looking at a 3,000 pound weekly limit, 6,000 pounds a week for basically a 6-week fishery. This last year, I think it was, basically for the fishermen, is not is not a viable, even if you buddy up, it's hardly a viable enterprise. And of course, the challenges are there for fish plants as well. But I guess the question to Mr. McCurdy would be, how is it any different that that the union can organize fishermen to form a co-op to purchase, for example, lobsters, which he feels that there's no work involved. But I'll tell you that I have approximately 30 people that work at lobsters, and so he can organize a co-op to vertically integrate the fishermen. Yet there's no opportunity for the plants that exist to vertically integrate themselves and make themselves more viable.
Well, I guess on the issue of the plants, that's a provincial matter. I think the history of you mentioned a couple of cases, and there have been a very small number of cases, usually very short-lived, where individual fishermen have held plants. That one in Ramia, for example. But for the most part, I'm not as familiar with the Codroy one, but for the most part, where that has happened, it's been when an operation had effectively, most of the cases I can think of anyway, not very many at all, had failed with another operator, and they went in and had a crack at it for a little while, and either used that as a lever to get a quota or something like that. But that Ramia one, for instance, was relatively short-lived, as I recall, and there haven't been very many of that nature. Co-op, when I commented on that earlier, I just look on that differently. I guess that's a function of where you sit, yeah. Where you stand depends on where you sit to a certain degree. I think I do pick up on your point on the leverage associated. On the TVRP one, we took a position, which was some of our members didn't agree with on the TVRP. That's a temporary vessel replacement policy. Of opposing that, because if an offshore company who has the privilege of a quota that another company doesn't have, and if they can shop that around to individual owner-operator, fishermen, then that can be and has been used as a lever to entice fishermen away from another operator, and I don't agree with that. I don't think that's fair ball. So I don't think it. To the extent you can prevent that, I think it's not a good policy, because it tilts the playing field.
Just as an aside, our plant is one in which it was a fisherman that ended up having a fish plant.
It was one, sorry?
Our plant is a good example of a fisherman that ended up owning a fish plant.
Yeah. There's a few that have done that where they've actually gone and ultimately become plant operators.
Yes.
I don't think there's many where they actually continued in both. There might be the scattered exception.
Well, the reason they couldn't continue in both is because of the policy that came into effect about 30 years ago, whereby they could no longer access new licenses that came out. So if the plant owned a vessel and a crab license came up, you might have been putting your name into the hat, but your name was being taken out of the hat before the draw was ever made, because you were a processor and you were not allowed to access new licenses. So basically, it came to a point where these vessels became less and less viable.
Excellent question and excellent discussion. We've got time for a couple more questions. For those of you who have something that you've been meaning to ask either Tom or Earle, either from tonight's discussion or from whenever, way back, now would be the time to do it. Yes, Olaf.
Okay, this is right out of left field or right field, I don't know, but Mr. McCurdy pointed to the New Zealand example as one that needed to be avoided, as a bad example of what could happen. Are there any models out there in other countries where things are being done in a positive manner, any good models that might provide some lessons for us to emulate or try to adapt or adopt?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm trying to think now where would be an appropriate place for comparison. Norway, maybe. to some extent. I've met some people in Norwegian fishery. There seem to be some aspects of how they do it there that have worked fairly well. Iceland had a bit of a cowboy mentality too. In fact, it really spilled over into their banking crisis they had that nearly killed nearly put the country out of it. Well, they almost had to join the EU, which would be the last thing in the world they want to do. I think that's still in play, although I think their hatred for the common fisheries policy will probably keep them away from that. But nonetheless, it almost collapsed the country. And a significant part of that, the build-up of that problem, was this huge overinvestment and speculative investment in fishing quotas, because they had that kind of a radical, wide-open ITQ program that they put in effect quite a number of years ago, and you ended up with these crazy. People end up spending way too much to buy quota, and we see that here when the whole business saying you got a quota and you can sell it. It sounds great, except what happens if we got the Tom mentioned, and rightly so, that the economic performance of the fishing fleets here is not great. Most of those licenses people acquired for a nominal sum, $100 or whatever it was at the time, and now you get the same license changing hands for a great big sum. So in addition to all the other costs that have made those marginal operations, you end up with a huge debt load just to get started. It makes it a prohibiting factor for the next generation. And just to come back to Roland's point there about can people acquire from quota from each other. Where it gets out of hand is when there's a bidding war. Anytime there's a bidding war for the right to fish, inevitably what happens is that people end up paying too much, and any profitability is gone. That's what inevitably happens. It's kind of like the psychology you get with a real estate bubble or a stock market bubble. You get this mentality of trying to outbid the next guy, and when the dust clears and the music stops, someone paid way too much, and they bought a pig in a poke. They bought something that just doesn't have enough value to offset what they paid for.
So the people who benefited are the people who are leaving the industry.
Yeah.
Tom, you're going to say something?
Yeah, just in preparing for this talk, I was speaking to Bob Verge, who's at the Center for Fisheries Innovation at the Marine Institute, and I asked him that question. He said, where have you seen his work? And he just picked up to what Earle just said in terms of Norway and Iceland. He said he was struck when he went over to Norway a couple of years ago, and he would see this kind of modern fishing enterprise, both on the processing side and the harvesting side. But he said, and then similar with Iceland, but Iceland has gone through some ebbs and flows in terms of what as Earle's indicated. But the key thing that Bob said, and I'm not sure if he's going to see this in the webcast, so if he doesn't want me to quote him, but he said, we're all in this together. It's not that kind of us versus them. I'm a harvester, you're a processor, never the twain shall meet. Is in terms of, is there a way to bring them together, and once again, and take advantage of the opportunities for sustainable fisheries for other species that are just not being taken advantage of right now, because once again, one of the reasons is because we don't have the science, but also because once again the fishery is an enormously risky business, and if if you're operating a boat with loads of debt because you had to go out or a vessel with loads of debt, or if you're operating a fishing plant with loads of debt, you're not going to be willing to take those kind of risks. But if you're into it together and there's some more sharing, then there may be more willingness to go out and take the risk because they're shared.
One point, if I just add to what I said about Iceland, which was actually quite consistent with what happened in BC, is there's been a tremendous concentration or deep kind of de-ruralization of the country, and a tremendous concentration of the fishing quotas in primarily Reykjavik. In the case of Iceland, in BC, it's in the lower mainland. And the alert bays and the little coastal communities in Iceland, there's been so it depends on what you want. If you believe that the ongoing survival of those small communities is a good thing, then you structure policy accordingly. If you want to get rid of them, you want to resettle them, or you want to, say that the better thing is to have people move into the cities, then I suppose that would suggest a different set of policies and priorities.
And I would say, if I was a processor, which I'm not, but I would say I'm already in those rural communities. I have big investments in these rural communities. I have loads of people working for me in these rural communities. So it's it's much easier to move a license, as you indicated, into an urban community, but it's much more difficult to move a fish plant into downtown St. John's. It's not going to be the opportunity there.
Yeah.
And so there's, I guess, in a number of ways, I take your point that there could be, still at the same side, how do you get the processors or give them the opportunity to control the supply, or to have some certainty about the supply so that they can make sure that they operate their operations effectively and efficiently, and right now, because of the bidding and because of the separation, it just, unless you have really good relationships, like as you indicated already, if you don't, that may be a reason to exit the market if you're a processor. But at the same time, there could be an opportunity to come together. So. Sorry, Earl, you were going to say something.
I was going to say, personally, I would have favored that out of the MOU process comes some kind of an assisted rationalization program that would give the opportunity for people to leave to get, because you got to have, if there's only dribs and drabs of fish, how many plants can you possibly carry on? This is a tremendous challenge, no question about it, trying to do it with little piddly amounts of fish, and just like it is with a fishing enterprise, you haven't got enough stuff to work with. And in the case of the Gulf, it's hard to imagine how you could manage it with that little bit of fish. I mean, the quota we might have this year, that God knows what we'll end up with. Even last year's quota, in the good old days, probably four of those good longliners from down your way, Roland, could have caught out the entire quota this year. If you take the the Harry Hatchers and some of those guys, tremendous fishermen, and this was with fixed gear. They didn't have big boats like the big boats today. They had good fishing boats, but they weren't. What were they? 60-footers? Yeah. And they went out and probably four of those guys will catch in a year on the average what the quota is for the entire Gulf from wherever it starts, Sank Surf Bay somewhere over towards Burgeo, right up to the tip of the Northern Peninsula, and including the Straits of Labrador. Jeez, what do you do with it? Here's $1. Get yourself a nice meal.
If I could, I was just following on from the what Earl was speaking about with the MOU process. I think ultimately, if you did have more vertical integration, then the processors who want to be involved are going to be willing to make the investment in terms of investing in parts of the fleet. The ones that don't really, either are not strong enough and probably shouldn't be in business, or secondly, just don't see this as a long-term viability, they're not going to be willing to make the investment. So I think one of the things that didn't happen after the MOU process, which probably should have, was that discussion in terms of which plants remain open, which plants should be, rationalized in a fair and equitable manner for all the people involved. And in a number of ways, this allows the people who want to stay, or the processors and the harvesters who want to stay in the industry, it gives them an ability to invest and to make it much more valuable enterprise on both sides. So I once again, I'm trying to hopefully try to make this as a win-win. Could be like once again an issue from the sorry.
Yeah, I'd like to touch on the point that you I'm sorry. I'd like to touch on the point that you just talked about there, like investing into a processing. Like I invested into processing for lobsters in Cadrat, and like I just got 2 years out of it. I got one year to start off. Last year we had problems with lobsters. This year we got problem with lobsters, and now we got the union coming in with a co-op, trying to form a co-op, and like my investment is gone. Like I'll leave for Earle to answer on something. Like what can you do with invest in new plants in Newfoundland?
Yeah. Sorry, what was the question?
Why would someone want to invest into a plant in Newfoundland? Like I put a lot of work and time into the plant in Cadbury for processing lobsters, and now this year you're out with a co-op saying, we want a co-op, we want to take lobsters off Newfoundland, and I'm in the picture.
Well, I guess we tried to negotiate. I don't know if it's productive in this form, but I'm willing to do it if you like. Get into the what's behind the dispute, but really it's about what's the fair share of for us, or what's the fair share of the market for the people who catch the fish, and the overwhelming view of the harvesters in that fishery was that they weren't getting a fair share, and in figuring that, in coming to that conclusion, they looked at what was paid elsewhere, and so we tried to get some way of doing that. So at the moment what we have is a price dispute. And so we didn't start off looking to form a co-op. We started off trying to get a resolution of a price that would have a lobster fishery.
I agree with you said there, like this is not the place
Can I
for
ask you
this.
to put your microphone a bit closer?
This is not the place for this, I agree with you 100%. But like even, like I got to say this, like we tried to come up with a price and it just didn't work for us. We never had much of a chance, I guess, because like you fellows just said, well, okay, we're going to go out and get a co-op, and we're going to start a co-op there now and just put us away.
Well, we only did that after the buyers, in a coordinated manner, said we're not buying. So we either say to a fisherman, you're out of luck this year, or we try and do something about it.
But I think if you was truthful about it and told the truth, that it's not the West Coast problem with the price. This happened back in 2010.
Happened in 2000. The problem goes it's with the people, the harvesters, and then I won't take the bait on whether I'm telling the truth. But
Maybe we should have a debate after.
Yeah, but it was much.
Yeah.
It was a widespread view that the prices here were in fact not where they should be. And one of the reasons I believe there's too many middlemen in the lobster fishery. And it's as simple as that. There's just not enough lobster for the amount of people that's at it. And if everyone got to take a cut of it, and then whatever's left, the residual that's left, is what goes for raw material. And this.
I think personally it was east and west.
Hmm?
Personally, I think it was east and west.
Tom wants to jump in?
No, I was just going to say one of the, my main job is to be, academic and to study companies and industries, etc. And one of the things that I've always been struck by with the fishery is just the lack of information, the lack of data, and because of that lack of data, because most of the companies are private, probably the last big publicly traded company in Newfoundland was Fishery Products International, if not the only big publicly traded company where you could see the information. But, if there's some way of trying to share that information and bridge that information, then you're going to have less mistrust in terms of are they telling a lie, are they telling the truth? And if I go back and I think about other industries where they're kind of having to share, mostly like for example, if I talked about the technology industry where there are companies that are owning each other, like whether it's a chip maker owns parts of an LCD company, etc. There's more information being shared. Then you're going to say, well, yeah, I'm not making money this year at this price, and you're going to know it because you've seen it and you know it over the last 5 years. And I think that's, once again, if I go back to, sorry to hit the hammer over again, but if that lack of cooperation and coordination and that just kind of extreme competition causes that problem. And so, like you say, I wouldn't want to make an investment. If I'm an because like you say, your whole business could be gone away tomorrow because of basically a dispute over he said, she said, and ultimately, is there another way? And I think that's really important. And I think the FFAW and the processors and the buyers and the government and everybody else should say, look, once again, is there a way to get this so that we are kind of coordinating and we are taking advantage of the opportunities as well?
Well, that's a good discussion upon which to end this evening's session. One thing is sure, and it is that the future will be upon us one day. And if we want the future that we want, then we have to create it. So from what I take of this session here tonight, if I can interpret Tom's message, is that we could be doing things better. And if I can interpret Earle's message, is that you got to be careful in trying to change things, that you don't get up on that slippery slope and lose everything. So I'm sure there is always a middle ground. Wars always end at some point, and peace happens. And I'm sure, not that this is a war, but a middle ground will be found in this situation as well. And it's up to our own creative abilities as human beings to find that solution. So having said that, I will want to thank our co-sponsors for tonight's event, the Long Range Economic Development Board and the Marine and Mountain Zone Corporation and their executive directors, Johnny McPherson and Lynn MacArthur, and their dedicated staff. I'd like to thank the really dedicated staff of the Harris Center, and you've seen them here tonight in the front doing technical stuff or in the black T-shirts. Really, they bring the session together. They just give me the platform here to have a bit of fun, but they've done all the work. So a hand of applause to our partners and our staff here. I want to thank our two presenters, and I'll give them a gift in a second, but I think that what they have done tonight is really, I thought it was I don't know a whole lot about the fishery. I learned a lot here about this particular policy and how it's impacting these sustainability of rural areas. So I want to thank them very much for they're taking the time to deliver a very strong presentation and for coming here and delivering it to you guys. And I'll give them a gift in a second. But before I do, I want to thank you guys for taking the time out. It's really windy out here in Port aux Basques. You've taken the time to come out and to listen to this presentation. And for those of you who are watching on the internet, thank you very much for sticking with us. I know it's not always easy to watch something on a computer screen, but we really appreciate your taking part in this. So as a reminder to our two presenters of the fine work that they've done, we're going to give them a little gift on behalf of you to recognize them. So please help me thank them.
Thank you, Mike.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Or Taylor's Memoirs, is it?
Thanks very much.
Thank you, folks.